Millionaire finds his past. Black maid at a restaurant with 3 kids who look just like him. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Jonathan Sterling always got what he wanted. At 45 years old, he was one of New York's most successful real estate developers. His face appeared regularly in business magazines, and his name meant power. Tonight, he sat alone at La Maison, the city's most expensive French restaurant, reviewing some papers about his newest project, a luxury high-rise that would make him even richer. "Would you like to see the wine list, Mr. Sterling?" the maitre d' asked, bowing slightly. Jonathan nodded without looking up from his papers. He was used to this kind of treatment, but then something caught his attention, a familiar laugh coming from across the room. A laugh he hadn't heard in 10 years, but still remembered perfectly. He looked up and his heart stopped. There she was, Alyssa Carter. She looked different now, older, but somehow even more beautiful than he remembered. Her black hair had a few strands of grey, but her smile was exactly the same. She wore a waitress uniform and carried plates to a nearby table with the grace she'd always had. Jonathan's mind raced back to those stolen moments 10 years ago. Alyssa had worked as his maid then, and their affair had been intense but short. He'd ended it abruptly, worried about what his family and business partners would say if they found out. She'd disappeared the next day, and he'd spent years trying to convince himself it was for the best. "Sir, the wine list." The maitre d' was still waiting. "Not now," Jonathan said, waving him away. He couldn't take his eyes off Alyssa. She moved between the tables, taking orders and chatting with customers. She seemed happy, confident, different from the shy maid he'd known years ago. Then he noticed the table she kept returning to. 3 children sat there, doing homework, while they waited for their mother's shift to end. The oldest looked about 9, a boy with serious eyes who helped his younger brother with math problems. The little girl, probably 6, colored in a book, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. The boy's serious expression, it was like looking in a mirror. All 3 children had his piercing blue eyes, the same ones he saw every morning in the mirror. The girl's nose crinkled exactly like his did when she concentrated. The younger boy had his mother's smile but his father's strong jaw. His children, they had to be his children. The room started spinning. Jonathan loosened his tie, feeling like he couldn't breathe. How was this possible? Why hadn't she told him? Then he remembered how he'd treated her, how he'd ended things without even letting her speak. Had she tried to tell him? Had she been carrying his child? No, his children, when he'd dismissed her so coldly. "Is everything all right, Mr. Sterling?" A concerned waiter approached his table. "How long has that waitress worked here?" Jonathan pointed at Alyssa, trying to keep his voice steady. "Miss Carter? About 5 years now. She's one of our best." So Miss Carter, she'd kept her own name, of course she had. He'd never offered her his. Jonathan watched as Alyssa helped her daughter pack up her coloring books. The little girl hugged her mother, and Jonathan saw his own mother's features in the child's face. The boys had his height, his build. How had he not known? How many times had they passed him on the street? He had to talk to her, had to understand. But as he stood up, his legs shaking, he saw the protective way Alyssa guided her children toward the exit. Their children, the family he'd never known he had. "Your check, Mr. Sterling." The waiter appeared again. "Put it on my account," Jonathan said, grabbing his coat, "and tell me which days Miss Carter works." As he hurried toward the exit, he heard the oldest boy say, "Mom, can we get ice cream on the way home?" "Not tonight, Marcus," Alyssa replied. "It's a school night." Marcus. His firstborn son was named Marcus. Jonathan followed them at a distance, watching as they walked to the subway station. He could have offered them a ride in his luxury car, could have given them everything they'd ever wanted. Instead, he stood in the shadows, a stranger to his own children, watching as they disappeared down the subway stairs. Back in his penthouse apartment, Jonathan paced all night. The faces of his children haunted him. How many birthdays had he missed? First days of school? Christmas mornings? While he'd been building his empire, his children had been growing up without him. He picked up his phone a dozen times to call his lawyer, but what would he say? That he'd just discovered he had 3 children with a woman he'd pushed away a decade ago, that he'd been too wrapped up in his own importance to even consider the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, Jonathan Sterling, the man who could buy anything he wanted, felt completely powerless. Money couldn't buy back lost time. His wealth couldn't erase the hurt in Alyssa's eyes when she'd glanced his way and quickly looked away. Tomorrow. He would go back to the restaurant tomorrow. He had to make this right somehow, had to find a way to be part of their lives. But as the sun rose over Manhattan, Jonathan realized that all his business success meant nothing compared to what he'd lost and what he hoped he might still have a chance to gain. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He showed up at La Maison the next evening, an hour before closing time. He sat at the same table watching Alyssa work. She noticed him this time. How could she not? But kept her distance, letting other servers handle his table. "Your usual wine, Mr. Sterling?" the waiter asked. "Just water," Jonathan replied. His hands were shaking too much for wine. The restaurant slowly emptied. Tonight, the children weren't there. Jonathan wondered where they were, who was watching them. All these everyday details of their lives that he knew nothing about. Finally, at closing time, Alyssa emerged from the back room with her purse. She'd changed out of her uniform into simple jeans and a sweater. She walked straight past him toward the door. "Alyssa, wait!" Jonathan stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. She stopped but didn't turn around. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Sterling. They're mine, aren't they?" His voice cracked. "The children. They're mine." Now she turned, and the look in her eyes made him step back. "Yes, they're yours, though you never gave me the chance to tell you that 10 years ago. Why didn't you try harder to reach me? I had a right to know." "A right?" Alyssa laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Like I had a right to be treated like a human being instead of something to be thrown away when it became inconvenient. I tried to tell you. I called your office 20 times. Your secretary always said you were too busy. I wrote letters. They came back unopened." Jonathan felt sick. He remembered telling his secretary to screen his calls more carefully back then, to keep away any distractions while he worked on a big deal. "I need to meet them," he said. "They're my children." "No." Alyssa's voice was firm. "They're my children. I raised them. I worked 3 jobs to put food on the table while they were babies. I was there for every fever, every nightmare, every skinned knee. Where were you?" "I didn't know." "Because you didn't want to know." Alyssa's calm cracked. "You were too worried about what your rich friends would think, too concerned about your precious reputation. Well, guess what? We did just fine without you. Marcus is top of his class. James is the best soccer player in his grade, and Sophie, she's already reading at a 3rd grade level, even though she's only in 1st grade. Each detail was like a knife in Jonathan's heart. Marcus, James, Sophie. His children had names, personalities, achievements, a whole life he knew nothing about. "Please," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve it, but please give me a chance to make things right." "Make things right?" Alyssa shook her head. "Do you know what Marcus asked me last Father's Day? He asked if his dad was dead because that would be better than thinking his father just didn't want him." Jonathan felt tears in his eyes. Him, Jonathan Sterling, who hadn't cried since his mother's funeral 20 years ago. "I want to help, financially at least. You shouldn't have to work so hard. We don't need your money." Alyssa's voice was ice cold. "I've managed just fine all these years. The kids have everything they need. But I could give them so much more. Private schools, vacations, their own rooms, everything they deserve." What they deserved was a father who stayed. Alyssa grabbed her purse tighter. "Now if you'll excuse me, I need to get home to my children." "Our children, as you say, but you'll have to prove that means something more than DNA." She turned to leave, but Jonathan called after her. "I'm not giving up. I'll be here every night if I have to. They're my family too." Alyssa paused at the door. "You know what Sophie said when she saw your picture in a magazine once? She said the man looked sad even though he was smiling. She was right. All your money, all your success, what's it worth if you're alone?" After she left, Jonathan sat in his car for hours, parked outside the restaurant. He thought about his huge empty penthouse, his meaningless relationships, his life that looked so perfect in magazines but felt so hollow. His phone buzzed. Another business crisis demanding his attention. Usually, he'd drop everything to deal with it. Tonight, he turned the phone off. He drove to his office and spent the night looking through old papers. Finally, in a box of things his secretary had marked non-essential correspondence, he found them. Alyssa's letters, still unopened after all these years. With trembling hands, he opened the first one. The paper was dated a week after she'd left his house. The words blurred as he read, "Dear Jonathan, I need to tell you something important. I'm pregnant." He read every letter, each one like a punch to the gut. She'd tried so hard to reach him. The last letter simply said, "I won't try again. Your silence has told me everything I need to know about what our relationship meant to you. I'll make sure our child knows they are loved, even if it's only by me. Child." She hadn't known about the twins yet. The sun was rising when Jonathan finally looked up from the letters. His face was wet with tears, his expensive suit wrinkled. He looked at himself in his office's window reflection and hardly recognized the man staring back. He had built skyscrapers, closed billion-dollar deals, been called a business genius. But he had failed at the most important thing of all, being a father, being a man worthy of the love Alyssa had once given him. Well, that was going to change. Starting today, Jonathan Sterling was going to fight for something more important than money or power. He was going to fight for his family. He just hoped it wasn't too late. The next few weeks changed Jonathan's life completely. Every evening he came to La Maison. Sometimes the children were there, sometimes they weren't. He learned their schedule. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, they did homework at the corner table while waiting for their mother's shift to end. He started small. One evening, he noticed Marcus struggling with math homework. "Is everything okay?" he asked, approaching their table carefully. "I'm pretty good with numbers. Maybe I could help?" Marcus looked up suspiciously, but Sophie smiled. She had Alyssa's warm smile, the one that had first captured Jonathan's heart years ago. "It's algebra," Marcus said finally. "I hate algebra." "You know, I used to hate it too," Jonathan said, pulling up a chair. "But then someone taught me a trick that made it much easier." From across the restaurant, Alyssa watched them. Her hands shook slightly as she carried plates to other tables. But she didn't interfere. Little by little, Jonathan became a regular presence in their lives. He never pushed, never demanded. He was just there, helping with homework, listening to Sophie's stories about school, watching James practice soccer moves between the tables. "Mr. Sterling knows everything about math," Sophie told her mother one evening. "He helped Marcus get an A on his test." "Did he?" Alyssa's voice was neutral, but Jonathan saw the conflict in her eyes. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, James was practicing soccer moves with a small ball in the restaurant's entrance when he tripped. Jonathan caught him before he fell. "Nice save," James said, grinning. "Do you like soccer?" "I love soccer," Jonathan replied. "I played in college." "Really? What position?" "Goalkeeper. Not very glamorous, but someone has to do it." James's eyes lit up. "That's my position too, but I'm not very good yet. Coach says I need more practice. I could give you some tips if your mom doesn't mind." They both looked at Alyssa, who was watching from nearby. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. The next Saturday, Jonathan met them at the local park. He'd bought proper goalkeeper gloves for James, but Alyssa stopped him before he could give them to the boy. "No expensive gifts," she said firmly. "We're not here for your money." "They're not expensive," Jonathan lied. "Just basic equipment. Every goalkeeper needs proper gloves." He spent 2 hours teaching James proper diving techniques and how to position himself. Marcus and Sophie watched from the sidelines, gradually getting drawn into the game. By the end of the session, all 3 children were taking turns trying to score against their father. "Again, let me try again," Sophie squealed as Jonathan dramatically dove to save her shot. Alyssa sat on a nearby bench, her face unreadable, but she didn't stop them from making plans for next Saturday. The news spread quickly through New York's high society. Jonathan Sterling seen playing soccer in a public park with a waitress's children. The gossip was vicious. "Have you lost your mind?" Jonathan's sister Victoria demanded, storming into his office. "Do you know what people are saying? That woman is obviously after your money." "That woman," Jonathan said coldly, "is the mother of my children." Victoria sank into a chair. "What? That's impossible. You never told me." "I never knew myself until now." Jonathan showed her a photo on his phone, him with the 3 children at the park. "Look at them, Victoria. Look at their faces. They're Sterlings, through and through." Victoria stared at the photo, her hand over her mouth. "Oh my God, they look just like you did at that age. They're amazing kids, smart, kind, talented. Alyssa did an incredible job raising them. But what are you going to do? You can't just..." "I can, and I will," Jonathan interrupted. "They're my family, more important than any business deal or social standing." That evening at the restaurant, Jonathan noticed Marcus was quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked, sitting down next to the boy. Marcus was silent for a moment, then asked, "Why do you come here every day?" Jonathan's heart raced, but he knew he had to be honest. "Because I care about you, all of you." "But why now? Where were you before?" The question Jonathan had been dreading. He looked across the restaurant at Alyssa, who was watching them intently. "I made a huge mistake," Jonathan said quietly. "The biggest mistake of my life. I hurt your mother very badly, and I missed out on watching you and your siblings grow up. I can never make up for that lost time, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to be part of your lives now." Marcus studied him with those serious eyes that were so much like his own. "Mom cries sometimes when she thinks we're asleep. Is that because of you?" Jonathan felt like someone had punched him in the gut. "Probably, yes. I was young and stupid, and I cared more about what other people thought than what was really important. And now I know better. Now I know that family is everything." Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "James's soccer game is next week. If you want to come, I'd like that very much." That night, after the children had gone home, Alyssa approached Jonathan's table. "Marcus told me what you said to him," she said, sitting down across from him. "I hope that was okay. I wanted to be honest with him." "It was okay." Alyssa twisted her hands together. "Look, Jonathan, I can't forgive you overnight. What you did, I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to be there for them now. They're starting to care about you," Alyssa said. "If you disappear again, I won't." Jonathan reached across the table, then stopped himself from touching her hand. "I swear on my life, Alyssa, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw a glimmer of the love they'd once shared in her eyes. Then she stood up. "James's game is at 4 next Saturday. Don't be late." Jonathan watched her walk away, hope blooming in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The day of James's soccer game arrived with dark clouds threatening rain. Jonathan got there 30 minutes early, wearing casual clothes instead of his usual designer suit. He'd cancelled 3 important meetings to be there, but business didn't matter today. His son was playing goalkeeper, just like he had at that age. "You came!" James ran over, already wearing his new gloves. "I didn't think you'd really come." The pure joy in his son's voice made Jonathan's throat tight. "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss it." Alyssa arrived with Marcus and Sophie, carrying folding chairs and snacks. She seemed surprised to see Jonathan already there. "There's room under our umbrella if it rains," she offered, and Jonathan's heart leaped at this small kindness. But then he noticed the whispers. Other parents were staring and pointing. He heard snippets of their conversations. "That's Jonathan Sterling. Those are his secret children. The mother's a waitress." Alyssa heard them too. Her back stiffened, and she wrapped her arms around herself protectively. "Don't let them bother you," Jonathan said quietly. "They're just jealous." "Jealous?" Alyssa laughed bitterly. "Of the woman who raised 3 kids alone while working as a waitress. Of the woman who raised 3 amazing children who are kind, smart, and talented. I'd say that's worth more than any amount of money." Before Alyssa could respond, the game began. James was incredible in goal, using the techniques Jonathan had taught him. When he made a particularly spectacular save, Jonathan jumped up cheering. "That's my boy," he shouted without thinking. The whispers grew louder. A woman in expensive tennis clothes approached them. "Jonathan Sterling, what a surprise seeing you here," she said with a fake smile. "I'm Amanda Worthington, head of the PTA. I don't believe I've met your friends." The way she said friends made it sound like a dirty word. "This is my family," Jonathan said firmly. "Alyssa Carter and our children, Marcus, James, and Sophie." Amanda's smile froze. "How interesting. You know, we're always looking for parental involvement in school activities, though usually from traditional families. What exactly are you implying?" Jonathan's voice was dangerously quiet. "Just that children need stability, structure, a proper family environment." "My children have all of that," Alyssa interrupted. "They have love, support, and everything they need." "Of course they do, dear," Amanda said condescendingly. "But surely you want what's best for them. Mr. Sterling could provide so much more, with the right arrangement." Jonathan stood up so quickly his chair fell over. "Mrs. Worthington, let me be very clear. These children have been raised perfectly by their mother. If you or anyone else has a problem with my family, you'll find yourself dealing with not just Jonathan Sterling, the father, but Jonathan Sterling, the businessman. And trust me, you don't want that." Amanda retreated, but the damage was done. Alyssa was shaking. "Is this what it's going to be like?" she asked quietly. "People judging us, looking down on the children?" "Not for long," Jonathan promised. "I'll handle it." The next day, he called a press conference. Standing in front of dozens of reporters, he took a deep breath. "I've called you here to address the rumors about my personal life," he began. "Yes, I have 3 children with Alyssa Carter. Yes, I only recently discovered their existence, due entirely to my own past mistakes. I'm not proud of my previous actions, but I'm incredibly proud of my children and their mother." The reporters went wild with questions. "Mr. Sterling, Will you seek custody? Are you planning to marry Ms. Carter? How will this affect your company's image? Jonathan held up his hand. My children are not a corporate issue or a social scandal. They're my family. Anyone who has a problem with that can take their business elsewhere. And yes, that includes our next real estate project. The Sterling Corporation will only work with partners who respect all families. That evening at La Maison, Marcus showed Jonathan his latest math test. Another A. Did you really mean what you said on TV? Marcus asked. About us being your family? Every word, Jonathan replied. I know I have a lot to make up for, but you, James, and Sophie are the most important people in my life now. Even more important than your big buildings. Much more important. Alyssa approached their table, coffee pot in hand. The restaurant's been getting calls all day, reporters wanting interviews. I'm sorry, Jonathan said. I can hire security if they're bothering you. No need. Alyssa smiled slightly. My boss gave me a promotion, said having a celebrity waitress is good for business. They all laughed, and for a moment, it felt like they were a real family. But later that night, Jonathan received a call from his biggest investor, Harold Montgomery. This family situation of yours is making people nervous, Harold said. The board is considering withdrawing their support for the new development. Then let them, Jonathan replied. I meant what I said, my family comes first. You're risking everything you've built. No, Jonathan said. For the first time in my life, I'm fighting for what really matters. After hanging up, he looked at his phone's background picture. A photo from James's soccer game, all three children huddled under the umbrella with him and Alyssa. Everything he'd ever wanted had been right there all along. He'd just been too blind to see it. The next morning, his sister Victoria showed up at his office again. The children need proper guidance, she insisted. Private schools, etiquette lessons, the right social connections. They need love, Jonathan corrected her, and their mother has given them plenty of that. But surely you'll seek custody. You can provide so much more. The only thing I'm seeking is the chance to be part of their lives, Jonathan said. On their terms and Alyssa's. I've already missed too much by putting my pride first. Victoria stared at him. You're still in love with her, aren't you? After all these years? Jonathan looked out his office window at the city he'd helped build. His buildings touched the sky, but they'd never filled the emptiness in his heart. I never stopped loving her, he admitted. I just forgot what was really important. But as he headed to the restaurant that evening, Jonathan didn't know that his biggest challenge was still to come. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and his was about to come back in a way that would threaten everything he was fighting to build. The trouble started with a phone call. Jonathan was at his office reviewing plans for a charity foundation he wanted to start for single mothers when his secretary buzzed him. Mr. Sterling, there's a Ms. Rebecca Worthington here to see you. She says it's urgent. Jonathan frowned. Another Worthington. He remembered Amanda from the soccer game and almost said no, but something in his secretary's voice made him curious. Send her in. The woman who entered his office was elegantly dressed and looked to be in her 50s. She carried an expensive handbag and wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jonathan Sterling, she said, sitting down without being invited. We need to talk about Alyssa Carter. Jonathan's hands clenched under his desk. What about her? 10 years ago, I was on the board of the Sterling Corporation. Do you remember what happened back then? Of course he remembered. It was right after he'd ended things with Alyssa. The company had been in the middle of its biggest deal ever, the downtown renovation project that had made him famous. What's your point, Ms. Worthington? My point is that I know what really happened. I know why Alyssa Carter really disappeared. Rebecca's smile turned cruel. Because I'm the one who made her go away. Jonathan felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. What are you talking about? You were distracted. The board was worried. We couldn't risk you throwing away everything for some maid. Rebecca waved her hand dismissively. So I had a chat with her, explained how she was ruining your life, your career, offered her a significant amount of money to disappear. You did what? Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper. She turned down the money, of course, very dramatic about it, but when I mentioned how the scandal would destroy you, Rebecca shrugged. Well, let's just say she loved you enough to leave. Jonathan remembered those days clearly now. How Alyssa had suddenly stopped trying to contact him, how she'd vanished without a trace. All this time he'd thought it was because of how cruelly he'd ended things. Why are you telling me this now? Because history is repeating itself. Rebecca leaned forward. The board is worried again, Jonathan. Your little public declaration of family values is touching, but it's bad for business. We're prepared to be generous, to all of them. Enough money to give those children everything they need far away from New York. Jonathan stood up slowly. Get out. Don't be hasty. Think about what's best for everyone. Those children don't belong in our world. You've seen how people treat them. I said get out. Jonathan's voice boomed through the office. And you can tell the board they have 24 hours to resign, every single one of them, or I'll make sure the whole world knows how they tried to manipulate my personal life 10 years ago. After Rebecca left, Jonathan sat in his office shaking. He had to tell Alyssa, but when he got to the restaurant that evening, he found chaos. Sophie was crying. Marcus looked angry. James was nowhere to be seen. What happened? Jonathan asked, rushing to them. Some kids at school, Marcus said through gritted teeth. They showed James an old magazine article about you, about all your girlfriends and fancy parties. They said our mom was just another one of your mistakes. Jonathan felt sick. Where's James? He ran home, Alyssa said, appearing behind them. He doesn't want to see you. Alyssa, we need to talk. I just found out something about what happened 10 years ago. Not now, Jonathan. Alyssa's voice was tired. I need to go home to our son. He's heartbroken. Let me come with you. Please. There's something you need to know. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice, or maybe she was just too tired to argue. But Alyssa nodded. They found James in his room at their small apartment. The boy was lying on his bed, face buried in his pillow. Go away, he shouted when Jonathan knocked. James, please, let me explain. Why? So you can lie to us again? Pretend you care about us. I'm not pretending. Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed. I made terrible mistakes in the past. I hurt your mother badly, but loving you three isn't one of those mistakes. James rolled over, his face streaked with tears. Then why did you leave us? Because I was a coward, Jonathan said honestly. I cared more about what other people thought than what was right, but I didn't know about you then. If I had, you would have what? James demanded. Given Mom money to go away? Like you did with all your other girlfriends? No. Jonathan looked at Alyssa, standing in the doorway. Never. And I just found out something about that time, about why your mother really left. He told them everything Rebecca had revealed. With each word, Alyssa's face grew paler. You didn't know? She whispered when he finished. About Rebecca's threat? Not until today. Alyssa, if I had known, would it have made a difference? Her voice was bitter. You made it pretty clear how you felt about me. I was wrong. So wrong. I loved you then, and He stopped himself, aware of James watching them intently. And what? James asked. Jonathan took a deep breath. And I love your mother still. I never stopped. I was just too proud and stupid to admit it. Silence filled the small room. Then Sophie's voice came from the hallway. Does this mean we're going to be a real family? They turned to find Sophie and Marcus standing there, hope shining in their eyes. That's up to your mother, Jonathan said softly. Alyssa wiped tears from her eyes. It's not that simple. There's so much hurt, so much time lost. Then let me make it right, Jonathan pleaded. Not with money or fancy schools or any of that. Just let me love all of you the way I should have 10 years ago. James sat up slowly. You really mean that? You're not going to leave again? Never. Jonathan looked each of them in the eyes. His children, the woman he loved. You're stuck with me now, if you'll have me. Sophie ran forward and hugged him. After a moment, James joined her. Marcus moved to his mother's side, taking her hand. Mum, Marcus asked quietly, are you okay? Alyssa looked at her family, their family, and something softened in her eyes. I don't know, but maybe we can try. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, but as they sat together in that small bedroom, sharing pizza and stories late into the night, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. This was where he belonged. This was what really mattered. The next morning he would deal with the board, with Rebecca, with all the threats to his family. But for now he just listened to his children laugh, watched Alyssa smile despite herself, and thanked whatever fate had given him this second chance. The morning newspapers were brutal. Sterling Empire in crisis, screamed the headlines. Board members threaten mass resignation. Sterling's secret family threatens billion-dollar deals. Jonathan sat in his office, phone ringing non-stop, but he wasn't answering. Instead, he was looking at a small photo on his desk, one of Alyssa from 10 years ago, smiling at the camera. He'd kept it hidden in his drawer all these years, unable to throw it away despite everything. His secretary buzzed. Mr. Sterling, the entire board is here for the emergency meeting. Send them in. They filed into his conference room, 12 men and women in expensive suits, led by Rebecca Worthington. They all looked shocked when they saw Alyssa sitting next to Jonathan. "What is she doing here?" Rebecca demanded. "Ms. Carter is here because this meeting concerns her and our children," Jonathan said calmly, "and because she has every right to hear what you did to our family 10 years ago." Rebecca's face went pale. "Now, Jonathan, let's be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Alyssa's voice was quiet, but firm. "Like when you threatened to destroy Jonathan's career if I didn't disappear. When you made me believe leaving was the only way to protect him." The other board members shifted uncomfortably. "Is this true, Rebecca?" Harold Montgomery, the eldest board member, asked. "We did what was necessary for the company," Rebecca insisted. "And we were right. Look at everything we've built. Are we going to let it all fall apart now because of some romantic notion of family?" Jonathan stood up slowly. "No, we're not going to let it fall apart, because every single one of you who knew about this manipulation is going to resign. Today." "You can't do this," Rebecca sputtered. "The shareholders will be very interested to hear about how board members interfered in my personal life and manipulated an innocent woman, how you kept me from my children for 10 years. The company will suffer," one of the younger board members warned. "Maybe," Jonathan agreed. "But I'm done putting profits before people. I lost my family once because of that mistake. I won't do it again." Harold Montgomery cleared his throat. "I had no knowledge of Rebecca's actions, Jonathan, but I support your decision. Family should come first." He stood up and faced the others. "I suggest those involved tender their resignations immediately." One by one, 5 board members, including Rebecca, placed resignation letters on the table. The others stayed seated, declaring their innocence of the past manipulation. "Get out," Jonathan told the resigned members, "and if any of you ever come near my family again, you'll regret it." Alyssa finished for him, standing by his side. After they left, Harold approached them. "Jonathan, I know this is personal, but the company will need a strong leadership team to weather this storm. Perhaps," he looked at Alyssa thoughtfully, "we should consider some fresh perspectives on the board." Jonathan turned to Alyssa. "You ran your own catering business before. You know how to manage people, budgets. Are you serious?" Alyssa looked stunned. "Me? On the board? Why not? You're smarter than half the people who just left, and you actually care about doing the right thing." That evening, they told the children about everything that had happened. They were sitting in Alyssa's small living room sharing Chinese takeout. "So Mum's going to be a boss too?" Sophie asked excitedly. "She always was a boss," Marcus said, making them all laugh. James looked worried. "But what about your company? Won't this hurt it?" "Some things are more important than money," Jonathan said, "like family. Besides," Alyssa added, "sometimes doing the right thing works out better in the end. People respect honesty more than they respect power." Jonathan looked at her with hope in his eyes. "Does this mean you're accepting the board position?" "I'll think about it," Alyssa said, but she was smiling. "I have 3 kids to consider after all." "And their father?" Jonathan asked softly. "Will you consider him too?" The children suddenly became very interested in their fortune cookies, trying to hide their grins. "That's complicated," Alyssa said, but her eyes were soft when she looked at him. "I know I have a lot to make up for," Jonathan said, "but I meant what I said last night. I never stopped loving you, Alyssa, even when I was too proud to admit it." "Dad's getting mushy," James whispered loudly to his siblings, making them giggle. "Yes, he is," Alyssa agreed, but she was blushing, "and he still has a lot of proving to do." "How about dinner?" Jonathan suggested. "Just the 2 of us, to discuss business strategies, of course." "Of course," Alyssa said dryly, "because that worked out so well last time." But when the children started chanting, say yes, she couldn't help laughing. "Fine, 1 dinner, to discuss business." Jonathan's heart soared, but he tried to keep his voice casual. "Tomorrow night? Mom already has a dress," Sophie announced proudly. "A really pretty blue one." "Sophie," Alyssa exclaimed, turning redder. "What? You bought it last week after Dad said you looked nice in blue." The adults stared at each other, both remembering the moment Sophie was talking about, a simple compliment during a hectic dinner service that had made Alyssa blush just like now. "Well," Jonathan said, fighting a smile, "I guess I'll wear my blue tie then." Later, as he was leaving, Alyssa walked him to the door. "This is crazy," she said quietly. "The board position, dinner. Life is crazy sometimes," Jonathan replied. "But I've learned that the crazy things can be the most important ones." He reached out slowly and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "I'm still scared," she admitted, "of trusting you again, of letting the children get too attached." "I know, but I'm not going anywhere this time." no matter what anyone says or does. Alyssa looked at their joined hands. One step at a time, one step at a time, Jonathan agreed. As he drove home that night, Jonathan felt lighter than he had in years. The company might struggle for a while, but he had something much more valuable now. A chance to rebuild his family, to earn back Alyssa's trust, to be the father his children deserved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The business world would be watching his every move. Society gossips would keep whispering, but none of that mattered anymore. Because when Sophie had called him dad, when James had laughed at his mushiness, when Marcus had smiled knowingly at his mother's blush, in those moments, Jonathan Sterling had finally understood what true success felt like. The blue dress was perfect. Alyssa stood in front of her mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The kids had insisted on helping her get ready for her dinner with Jonathan. "You look like a princess, Mom," Sophie exclaimed, carefully placing a small silver necklace around her mother's neck. "Are you going to kiss him?" James asked, making kissing noises until Marcus threw a pillow at him. "It's just dinner," Alyssa insisted, but her hands were shaking as she put on her earrings. The doorbell rang and all three children raced to answer it. Jonathan stood there in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a bouquet of white roses, the same flowers Alyssa had always kept in her little room at his house all those years ago. "You remembered," she said softly. "I remember everything about you," Jonathan replied. Their eyes met, and for a moment it was like no time had passed at all. "Okay, kids, bedtime," announced Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who was babysitting. "Let your parents have their evening." "Parents," Jonathan repeated quietly as they walked to his car. I love the sound of that. He'd made reservations at a small Italian restaurant, not the fancy places he usually frequented, but a cozy, family-owned place where they could talk privately. "No la maison tonight?" Alyssa teased. "I thought you deserved a night off from work." Jonathan pulled out her chair. "Besides, I wanted you all to myself." Over pasta and wine, they talked about everything and nothing. About the children's early years, first steps, first words, first days of school. About Jonathan's lonely climb to success, the empty achievements that had never filled the hole in his heart. "I used to see you sometimes," Alyssa admitted. "Your picture in magazines, on TV. The children would point you out, not knowing." "I wish I had known," Jonathan said. "Every time I saw a child with their parent, I felt this emptiness. Now I know why." "You can't get those years back, Jonathan." "No, but I can make sure every year from now on counts." Their hands found each other across the table. The simple touch sent electricity through both of them. "The board position," Alyssa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you sure about that? People will talk. Let them talk. You're smart, capable, and you understand what's really important in life. The company needs someone like you." "And what about us?" Alyssa asked quietly. "What do we need?" Before Jonathan could answer, a commotion at the restaurant entrance caught their attention. Rebecca Worthington was there, clearly drunk, pointing at their table. "There they are," she shouted. "The maid who ruined everything. You think you can just walk into our world, take what's ours?" Jonathan started to stand, but Alyssa beat him to it. She walked straight up to Rebecca. "I didn't take anything," she said calmly. "You tried to take my happiness, my children's father, all those years ago. Not anymore. I'm not afraid of you or your threats now." "You little—" Rebecca raised her hand to slap Alyssa, but Jonathan caught her wrist. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Security, please escort Ms. Worthington out. And Rebecca, expect a restraining order on your desk tomorrow." After Rebecca was gone, Jonathan turned to Alyssa. "I'm so sorry about that." But Alyssa was smiling. "You know what? I'm not. 10 years ago I ran away when she threatened me. Tonight I stood my ground because now I know what I'm fighting for." They decided to skip dessert and take a walk instead. The night was warm and stars twinkled above the city lights. "Remember our first kiss?" Jonathan asked as they passed a small park. "In your garden. I was arranging those white roses and you just couldn't resist anymore," Jonathan finished. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I can't resist now either." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was soft, gentle, full of 10 years of longing and regret and hope. When they finally broke apart, Alyssa's eyes were shining with tears. "Jonathan, I know we have to take things slow," he said quickly. "For the kids, for ourselves. But I want you to know, I'm in this for real. All of it. The family dinners, the homework help, the soccer games, the board meetings, and the society events. The good days and the bad. I want it all with you." Alyssa touched his face gently. "You've changed. You changed me. You and our children. You showed me what really matters." They walked back to his car, hand in hand. When they got to Alyssa's apartment, the lights were still on. "The kids are probably still awake," Alyssa said, laughing. "They're too excited about tonight to sleep." Sure enough, 3 faces quickly disappeared from the window when they looked up. "Come up," Alyssa offered. "We could have that dessert we missed. I made chocolate cake yesterday." "You still bake?" Jonathan remembered her amazing desserts from years ago. Some things never change. They found the children pretending to be asleep on the couch, very unconvincingly. "How was dinner?" Sophie asked, abandoning the pretense immediately. "Did you kiss?" James added. "Did you talk about the board position?" That was Marcus, always practical. Jonathan and Alyssa looked at each other and burst out laughing. "Yes to all 3, Jonathan said, pulling Sophie onto his lap as they settled on the couch. "Does this mean you're staying?" Marcus asked quietly. Jonathan looked at his oldest son, seeing his own seriousness reflected there. "Yes, I'm staying, if that's okay with all of you." The children looked at their mother. Alyssa's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "I think," she said slowly, "that would be very okay." Later, after the children had finally gone to bed for real, Jonathan and Alyssa stood at her door again. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you for giving me another chance, for giving us another chance." This time when they kissed, it felt like coming home. As Jonathan drove back to his penthouse, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mum's still smiling. Good job, Dad." Dad. The word brought tears to his eyes. He had a lot of lost time to make up for, a lot of trust to rebuild. But for the first time in 10 years, Jonathan Sterling felt truly, completely happy. The news hit the morning papers like a bomb. Sterling heir challenges father's new family. Jonathan's nephew, David Worthington, Rebecca's son, was suing for control of the company. "He claims I'm mentally unfit to lead," Jonathan explained to Alyssa over breakfast at her apartment. It had become their morning routine. He'd bring fresh bagels, help get the kids ready for school, and they'd share coffee before facing the day. "Can he do that?" Marcus asked, looking up from his cereal. "He can try," Jonathan said grimly, "but he won't succeed." Sophie climbed into her father's lap. In the month since their first dinner date, she'd become increasingly affectionate with him. "Is this because of us?" "No, sweetheart." Jonathan hugged her tight. "It's because some people care more about money than family, but they're going to learn that family always comes first." Alyssa watched them with worried eyes. "Maybe I shouldn't take the board position. It's just giving them more ammunition." "No way," James protested. "Mom, you're the smartest person we know. The company needs you." Jonathan smiled at his son's fierce defense. "James is right. We're not letting them intimidate us." But the situation got worse at school. David's lawsuit had stirred up all the old gossip, and the children were feeling the effects. "Hey, Sterling," a boy called out as James walked to soccer practice. "Is it true your mum was the maid?" James's fists clenched, but he remembered what his father had taught him about handling bullies. "Yeah, she was. Now she's a company director. Funny how life works, isn't it?" The other boy wasn't finished. "My mum says your dad's only playing family because he's having a midlife crisis. Says he'll get bored and leave again." This time James couldn't hold back. The fight was brief but messy. Both boys ended up in the principal's office. Jonathan rushed from a board meeting when he got the call. He found James sitting outside the principal's office, sporting a black eye. "I'm sorry, Dad," James said miserably. "I know you said not to fight, but—" Jonathan sat next to him. "Want to tell me what happened?" After James explained, Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what? I'm proud of you. Really? But you said fighting was wrong." "It is, usually. But standing up for your family, that's never wrong. Though next time, maybe use words instead of fists." James managed a small smile. "Like you did with the board?" "Exactly. The best fights are won with brains, not bruises." When Alyssa arrived, she was torn between concern and anger. "This has to stop, Jonathan. The children shouldn't have to defend our family to anyone." "You're right." Jonathan stood up. "Which is why I'm calling a press conference today." 2 hours later, Jonathan stood before the cameras, his family beside him. He'd insisted they all be there, wanted the world to see them standing together. 10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life," he began. "I let fear and pride keep me from the woman I loved and the family we could have had. When I discovered I had 3 amazing children, it was like being given a miracle I didn't deserve." He looked at each of his children, then at Alyssa. "Some people claim I'm not thinking clearly because I've embraced my family. They're wrong. I've never thought more clearly in my life. Success isn't about money or power. It's about love, loyalty, and doing what's right. Turning back to the cameras, his voice grew stronger. To those who would try to hurt my family or damage my company because they can't accept change, you will fail. The Sterling Corporation isn't just about buildings anymore. It's about building a better future, one where family values mean more than stock values. After the press conference, they retreated to Jonathan's penthouse. It was the first time the children had been there, and they explored the huge space with wide eyes. "You live here all alone?" Sophie asked, looking around the pristine living room. "It never felt like home," Jonathan admitted. "Not really. Our apartment's smaller," James said, "but it's cozier." "Way cozier," Marcus agreed. "Mom makes it feel like home." Jonathan looked at Alyssa, who was standing by the window looking out at the city. "She does, doesn't she?" Later, while the kids were playing video games on Jonathan's massive TV, he joined Alyssa at the window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Everything's changing so fast," she said. "Sometimes I wake up thinking it's all a dream." "If it is, I don't want to wake up." Jonathan took her hand. "Move in with me." Alyssa turned to stare at him. "What?" "All of you. Move in here. Or we can buy a new place together, somewhere that can be our home, not just mine." "Jonathan, I know it's fast," he said quickly, "but haven't we wasted enough time? The kids are already dealing with all this attention. Wouldn't it be better if we were together? Really together?" "Mom," Sophie called from the couch. "Can we get a dog if we move in with Dad?" Alyssa laughed despite herself. "You were listening." "Obviously," Marcus said, "and I vote yes. This place has enough room for 2 dogs. 3 dogs, James added hopefully. Jonathan pulled Alyssa closer. "See? The kids are on my side." "The kids want dogs," Alyssa corrected, but she was smiling. "Is that a yes?" Alyssa looked at their children, James and Marcus arguing about dog breeds, while Sophie drew pictures of her dream puppy. Then she looked at Jonathan, who was watching her with so much love in his eyes. "1 dog," she said finally. "We'll start with 1 dog." Jonathan's face lit up. "Really? You mean it? Yes to the dog, yes to moving in together, yes to—" She didn't get to finish because Jonathan was kissing her, lifting her off her feet while the children cheered. "Oh, gross," James complained, but he was grinning. "Get used to it," Jonathan said, setting Alyssa down but keeping his arm around her. "Because I plan to kiss your mother every chance I get for the rest of our lives." That night, after they'd ordered pizza and watched movies and put the kids to bed in Jonathan's guest rooms, they stood on his balcony looking at the stars. "Are you sure about this?" Alyssa asked. "It's a big step. I've never been more sure of anything." Jonathan turned her to face him. "I love you, Alyssa Carter. I love our children. I love the family we're becoming. The rest, the lawsuit, the gossip, all of it, that's just noise." Alyssa touched his face gently. "When did you get so wise?" "When I finally learned what matters." He kissed her softly. "Welcome home." But even as they stood there, happy in each other's arms, new storms were gathering. David's lawsuit was just the beginning. Sometimes the biggest threats come from where you least expect them, and the Sterling family's greatest test was still to come. Moving day was chaos. Boxes were everywhere in Jonathan's penthouse, and Sophie's new puppy, a golden retriever she'd named Lucky, wasn't helping by trying to play with every piece of packing tape he could find. "No, Lucky!" Sophie giggled as the puppy tangled himself in a ribbon of tape. "Dad, help!" Jonathan loved how naturally she called him Dad now. All 3 children had started using it regularly, and each time his heart swelled with joy. "I still can't believe we're really doing this," Alyssa said, watching Jonathan untangle the excited puppy. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. "No," she smiled at him. "For the first time in my life, everything feels right." That's when Marcus came running in, his face pale. "Dad, Mom, you need to see this." He was holding his tablet, showing a breaking news story. The headline made Jonathan's blood run cold. "Sterling Children's Paternity Questioned." The article quoted anonymous sources, claiming that Alyssa had made up the whole story about Jonathan being the father. There were suggestions that she had planned this for years, waiting for the right moment to claim her children were his. "That's ridiculous," James shouted, reading over their shoulders. "We look just like Dad." "David," Jonathan growled. "This has to be his work." Alyssa sat down heavily on a box. "They're saying I'm a gold digger, that I made everything up to get your money." "We'll do a DNA test," Jonathan said immediately. "Prove them wrong." "No!" Alyssa stood up, angry now. "We shouldn't have to prove anything. Look at them." She gestured to their children. "Anyone with eyes can see they're yours." "Then we'll sue for libel," Jonathan decided. "I'll call our lawyers." But before he could finish, his phone rang. It was Harold Montgomery. "Jonathan, turn on the news. Now." They switched on the TV to find David Worthington holding his own press conference. "My cousin Rebecca revealed something disturbing," David was saying. 10 years ago, Alyssa Carter was involved with multiple men at the Sterling estate. The children's paternity was never confirmed. We demand DNA testing before she's allowed to take her board position or make any claims on the Sterling fortune." Sophie started crying. "Why are they being so mean?" Jonathan pulled her close. "Because they're scared, sweetheart. Scared of losing their power, their control." "I'll do it," Marcus said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. "The DNA test. Let's prove them wrong." James nodded. "Me too. Let's show everyone who we are." Alyssa looked at her children with tears in her eyes. "You don't have to do this, we know the truth. But maybe we should let the world know too," Marcus said wisely. "Then they'll have to leave us alone." Jonathan had never been prouder of his children. "It's up to you," he told them. "All of you. Whatever you decide, we'll face it together." But before they could decide, there was another shock. Jonathan's sister, Victoria, burst into the penthouse, looking distraught. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry," she said. "I tried to stop him, but David, he's found Mum's old diaries." Jonathan felt his stomach drop. "What?" "She wrote about Alyssa, about suspecting there was something between you two, but she also wrote about other men at the estate who—" Victoria glanced at the children and lowered her voice. "David's going to use it to support his claims." "That's a lie," Alyssa was shaking. "I never—" "We know," Jonathan assured her, "but David's trying to create doubt. He knows that even if we prove the children are mine, the scandal could damage the company." "I won't let them hurt my babies," Alyssa said fiercely. "None of us will," Victoria surprised them by saying. "I was wrong before, Jonathan. This is your family and they're my family too. I'll testify about the diaries, prove they've been taken out of context." Jonathan hugged his sister. "Thank you." But their troubles weren't over. That evening, as they were trying to get the apartment in order, Jonathan received another call. It was his biggest client threatening to pull out of their latest project. "The board is meeting tomorrow," Harold told him. "Some members are suggesting a temporary leave of absence for both you and Alyssa until this situation is resolved." After he hung up, Jonathan found Alyssa in what would be their bedroom, sitting among half-unpacked boxes. "Maybe we should wait," she said quietly. "Moving in together? The board position? Give things time to settle down." "No," Jonathan sat beside her. "That's exactly what they want, to make us doubt ourselves, each other. I won't let them win. But the company can survive this. What I can't survive is losing you again." He took her hands in his. "Alyssa, marry me." She stared at him. "What?" "Marry me. Not because of the scandal or the company or what anyone thinks. Marry me because I love you. Because these past few months with you and our children have been the happiest of my life. Marry me because we've wasted enough time already." "Dad?" They turned to find all 3 children in the doorway. "Did you just propose to Mum?" Jonathan smiled. "Yes, I did, but she hasn't answered yet." "Say yes," Sophie bounced excitedly. "Please, Mum." James rolled his eyes, like she's going to say no, but Marcus was watching his mother carefully. "Mum, are you okay?" Alyssa was crying, but she was also smiling. "I'm better than okay." She turned to Jonathan. "Yes, yes to all of it. The marriage, the family, the fights ahead, everything." Jonathan pulled her into a kiss while their children cheered. Even Lucky barked excitedly, running in circles around them. Later that night, after the children were asleep in their new rooms, Jonathan and Alyssa stood on their balcony. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," he warned her. "The board meeting, the press—" "Let them come," Alyssa said firmly. "We're stronger together." Jonathan pulled her close. Remembering that frightened young maid he'd fallen in love with 10 years ago, she was stronger now, fiercer, and so was he. But as they stood there planning their future, they didn't know that David had one more card to play. One secret that could tear their family apart just as it was coming together. Because sometimes the darkest storms come just before the dawn, and the Sterling family's greatest test was about to begin. The morning of the board meeting dawned grey and stormy. Jonathan and Alyssa arrived early at Sterling Tower, their children insisting on coming with them for support. "Whatever happens," Marcus told them, "we're family now. Nobody can change that." But as they walked into the building, David Worthington was waiting with a triumphant smile. "I was hoping you'd bring everyone," he said. "They should all hear this." He held up a manila envelope. "Do you know what this is, Uncle Jonathan?" "More lies?" Jonathan asked coldly. "Actually, it's the truth. The one thing that will destroy your perfect little family." David turned to Alyssa. Or should I ask your sister about it? Alyssa went pale. What? Your twin sister, Maria Carter, the one who also worked at the Sterling estate that summer, the one who died in a car accident 9 years ago. Jonathan felt like the floor was spinning. Twin sister? That's right, David smirked. 2 identical sisters, both working at the estate. So who really had the affair with Uncle Jonathan? Who's really the mother of these children? The dates of Maria's accident would match up perfectly with why Alyssa suddenly appeared with 3 children. Stop it! Alyssa's voice shook. How dare you bring up my sister? The children looked confused and scared. Sophie was crying quietly. Mom? Marcus asked. What's he talking about? Tell them, Alyssa, David pressed. Tell them how you took over your dead sister's life, how you're not really their mother at all. That's enough, Jonathan roared. But before he could say more, someone else spoke up. I can tell them the truth. Everyone turned to see an elderly woman stepping off the elevator. It was Mrs. Chen, who had been the Sterling estate's housekeeper for 40 years. Martha, Jonathan was surprised. What are you doing here? Fixing a wrong? Mrs. Chen said firmly. She walked straight up to David. I remember everything about that summer. Yes, Alyssa had a twin sister who also worked at the estate, but Maria worked in the gardens. She never came inside. It was Alyssa who worked as a maid, Alyssa who fell in love with Jonathan. You can't prove that, David snapped. Actually, I can. Mrs. Chen opened her purse and pulled out an old photograph. This was taken at the staff summer party. Both sisters are in it. Maria in her gardening clothes, Alyssa in her maid's uniform. Standing on opposite sides of the photo because they were barely speaking to each other by then, Jonathan took the photo with trembling hands. There they were, identical twins, but so different. Maria looked shy, withdrawn, but Alyssa was looking at him across the crowd, that same look of love he'd never forgotten. I remember this day, he said softly. You were upset because Maria had said something cruel about us. She didn't understand, Alyssa whispered. She thought I was being foolish, falling in love with the boss. After I lost her, I couldn't bear to talk about her. It hurt too much. A lovely story, David sneered, but it doesn't prove anything about the children. Actually, came another voice, it does. Harold Montgomery stepped forward. The board has already seen the DNA test results. Everyone stared at him. What DNA test? David demanded. The one Jonathan and Alyssa took privately last week, along with the children. The results are conclusive. They are without any doubt Jonathan's children, and Alyssa is without any doubt their mother. But, David sputtered. It's over, David, Jonathan said quietly. You've lost. The board has already voted, Harold continued. You're out, David, and your mother's old position will be filled by someone who actually cares about this company's future. He smiled at Alyssa. Welcome to the board, Ms. Carter. Or should I say, the future Mrs. Sterling. David stormed out, his schemes finally defeated. As security escorted him from the building, Jonathan turned to his family. I'm so sorry about your sister, he told Alyssa. Why didn't you tell me? After she died, it was too painful. And then when we found each other again, there was so much else happening. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I should have told you. No more secrets, Jonathan said, pulling her close. From any of us. Is that really you in the photo, Mom? Sophie asked, peering at the old picture. You look so young and beautiful, Jonathan added, just like you do now. 1 month later, the Sterling family gathered in Jonathan's, now their, penthouse garden. White roses bloomed everywhere, just like they had that summer long ago. But this time, Alyssa wasn't arranging them as a maid. She was walking through them in a beautiful white dress, her children preceding her down the aisle. Sophie scattered rose petals, beaming with joy. James and Marcus walked on either side of their mother, both in matching suits. Lucky trotted behind them, a ring-bearer's pillow carefully attached to his collar. Jonathan waited at the end of the aisle, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Victoria stood beside him, having proved herself a fierce defender of her new sister-in-law. Harold Montgomery sat in the front row, along with Mrs. Chen, both beaming with approval. When Alyssa reached him, Jonathan took her hands in his. 10 years ago, I let you walk away. It was the biggest mistake of my life. And now? Alyssa asked softly. Now I'm never letting go. He squeezed her hands. You and our children are everything to me. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. When they kissed as husband and wife, their children cheered the loudest. Lucky barked excitedly, making everyone laugh. Later, during the reception, Marcus tapped his glass for attention. I want to make a toast, he said, standing tall and proud, To my parents, both of them, thank you for showing us that it's never too late for love, for family, for second chances. To second chances, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Jonathan looked around at his family, his beautiful wife, his amazing children, even the excitable puppy now sleeping under the table. The Sterling Empire was stronger than ever, but that didn't matter anymore. He had something far more precious now. "What are you thinking about?" Alyssa asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "About how lucky I am," he replied, "and about how love really does conquer all, even evil cousins and old secrets, especially those." He kissed her softly. "I love you, Mrs. Sterling." Alyssa smiled that smile that had first stolen his heart so long ago. "I love you too." As they danced under the stars, their children watching with happy smiles, Jonathan knew that this was what true success felt like. Not the buildings he'd built or the deals he'd made, but this family, this love, this second chance he'd been given, and this time he would never let it go. The end.